So, Zenos. Does this combat sexual person belong in the Endwalker storyline? I've heard some players over the years that are of the opinion that Zenos is not particularly relevant to the themes within Endwalker. My own opinion is that he absolutely belongs. I think he adds a critical dimension to the themes of Endwalker. So let's start off with Zenos' upbringing, because that is critical to understanding why Zenos is relevant in Endwalker. Zenos is the son of Varus, meaning he is effectively the great-grandson of Solus, the infamous Emet-Selch. As a reminder, Garlean Empire was a tool created by Emet-Selch to serve the Ascians' goals of rejoinings. Thus, Zenos was brought up more or less brainwashed to be the imperial heir to the Garlean Empire, that is, meant to serve the Ascians' goals. His mother got sick and died shortly after Zenos was born, and his father Varus would go multiple months without seeing him. Basically, Zenos was brought up and surrounded by obedient servants who feared his status. So, how exactly did Zenos end up taking an interest in the blade? Well, his father Varus forced a Kovosi swordmaster to teach Zenos the art of the blade. How? By holding the swordmaster's family hostage. Obviously, that didn't turn out particularly well. The Kovosi swordmaster was often physically abusive towards Zenos. Eventually, the swordmaster even tried to kill Zenos, but Zenos, through relying on his own observation of the swordmaster, combined with drawing ether from a crystal, wielded the Kovosi swordmaster's art and defeated the man. Supposedly, this was when Zenos' desire and obsession for accelerating battles arose. Zenos may have a twisted personality, but it is undoubtedly a result of his upbringing. He had no parental figure, was raised by servants who feared his status, was taught by an abusive man who was only there because said man's family was held hostage. Everything Zenos was taught was meant to turn him into a useful pawn to carry out Emet-Selch's plan for the Garlean Empire. This background information on Zenos is critical to understanding his role and relevance in Endwalker. In Endwalker, we of course deal with the final days. Meteion and Entelechy, created by Hermes in the ancient times, gathered the despair of multiple fallen planets and now sing a song of despair that causes those who fail to overcome their despair to transform into monstrosities. More or less, the story within the Endwalker expansion has a strong focus on not giving in to despair and finding even just a small tiny spark, maintain a hope for life. The story itself is to live life fully and purposefully to your last breath, even if your end is all but assured. To seek and find joy even in the darkest of days. So let's return back to Zenos and his upbringing. You think that based on how miserable his upbringing is, he would have every reason to succumb and give up on life, right? But no, for what it's worth, Zenos was able to find that little spark that kept him going. Is it a twisted desire? Yes, of course it is. But nonetheless, it is a literal spark that kept him going. Zenos' literal spark is his desire to do battle with the Warrior of Light once more. Now consider this. What does the Warrior of Light represent? Of course, it's hope itself. So basically, the Warrior of Light gave hope, gave that literal spark to even an enemy such as Zenos, which effectively prevented Zenos from succumbing to despair. Is this not in itself highly relevant to the anti-nihilistic themes in Endwalker? I think it is. But there's more. It is also my belief that Zenos actually serves to mock those who succumb to despair. The reality is that although Zenos has that little spark he clings onto, it is undoubtedly a twisted desire. His presence within the story effectively poses the following question. If even someone as messed up in the head as Zenos can find something to cling onto, how can good men and women succumb to despair? In my opinion, this could have been the message from Nishikawa herself, and functions as an implied commentary on society. If the psychotic freaks of the world, who, by the way, are highly likely to be drawn to and abuse positions of power, if these psychotic freaks stick around, can good men and good women just give up? The answer is obviously no. Might as well go down swinging rather than give up. Now maybe I am reading a bit too much into this, but from what I know, Ishikawa often integrates subliminal messaging in her writings. Let's turn to a supporting theme in Endwalker, namely the concept of existing beyond becoming more than your intended design. This supporting theme is of course intertwined with the whole storyline addressing the hubris of the so-called ancients. On Elpis, we find out about how the gods will basically assess different creations and determine their worthiness to exist. Beings who fail to satisfy the ancients' criteria are erased. This was in fact one of the sources of Hermes' sadness. It is hubris to think you can somehow determine purpose and worth of another being. That is the hubris of the ancients. Don't forget that until the very end, Emmett Selk himself thought of everyone in the current day and age as unworthy, and as he himself put it, not even truly alive.
Yes, moral relativism and all that. Case in point, I do not consider you to be truly alive, ergo I will not be guilty of murder if I kill you.
The gods also thought they could control the world and bring back their paradise. Instead, they would have repeatedly sacrificed the lives of their citizens and the beings of Aetheris to fuel Zodiac. Only Vanar's actions put a stop to that. Hermes created the meteor, sending them out to search for answers to his depression from the stars. Instead, Meteon absorbed the despair of all the fallen civilizations of multiple planets and became the Endsinger that would bring about the final days to Aetheris. Zenos was effectively brainwashed to serve Emmett Selk's plan for the Garlean Empire. Instead, Zenos broke free, completely destroying the Garlean Empire while pursuing his own combat sexual desires, twisted as that may be. These are all examples that mirror one another to reflect the hubris of the ancients. On the opposite side, in contrast, Vanar and the 12 gods that we meet in the Endwalker Alliance raids, they willingly passed on the torch to the living beings of the current age. So the background of Zenos and his eventual role in destruction of the Garlean Empire is a reflection and mirrors this supporting theme. Could this be another one of Ishikawa's subliminal message that those of the older generation should let go and stop imposing themselves on the younger generation? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. On to my last point, which is related to the character development and the whole best friend thing with Zenos. Let me ask you this question, and I really want you to think about this. When two individuals, two countries, or whatever have different cultural views and personal beliefs, what does it take for both sides to come to an accord and be somewhat cooperative? Some of you may think that as long as there's communication and understanding can be reached. I personally disagree with that. I believe that often, despite communication, individuals will still stick to their own experiences and their own beliefs, and will always struggle to understand those who have a very different opinion. I'm of the belief that in the very end, it's about respect. It's about live and let live, even if you may not comprehend why others decide to live the way they do. Of course, that's with a caveat of, truly harmful practices, but let's not jump down that rabbit hole. Why am I bringing this up and why am I talking about this? Well, I'm sure some of you remember this scene where Alice points out an important point to Zenos.
Perhaps you found meaning in living this way. I cannot deny you found strength. Yet if you only pursue your hedonistic pleasures and pay no heed to the plight of others, then no one will give you the time of day.
Zenos, for most of the game's history, carries multiple psychopathic traits such as narcissism and more. He is unable to comprehend and see from the perspective of others, and is entirely self-serving despite his obsession to be a friend of the Warrior of Light. At the same time, once you know of Zenos' upbringing, I personally find it hard to blame the man completely for, the way that he is. But you know, Zenos, before his end, he actually did successfully grow as a person. Let me explain. Think about this. Why exactly did Zenos come to aid the Warrior of Light against the Endsinger? Zenos clearly doesn't care about getting rid of the Endsinger to save Aetheris, and yet he did come to help us. All this demonstrates is that Zenos, for the first time in his life, actually gained a little bit of understanding of what is required in any sort of friendship connection, to actually acknowledge the viewpoints and priorities of another person, even if he himself may not fully comprehend said viewpoint. In the Warrior of Light's case, that was obviously saving Aetheris. Now, some of you might argue that this isn't particularly meaningful because Zenos only wants the Warrior of Light's full attention on battling against him. But I would argue that, and not to be a downer, but in reality, people who are narcissists realistically will never even be able to do what Zenos did. The fact that Zenos, despite himself not valuing the Warrior of Light's priorities, finally considered the possibility that by giving the Warrior of Light a hand with saving Aetheris, that the Warrior of Light might reciprocate his twisted desires, that I think has to be worth something. To me, that is someone who actually tried to build something new, to become something more. And in the context of his awful upbringing, I personally chose to reward his limited growth.
Ha! Acceptance! At long last!
Because I think when someone who is completely self-serving actually tries for the first time in his life, in Zenos' case, to actually do something, to take into consideration someone else's priorities and do something about it, which is for the Warrior of Light, that just has to mean something. I think that's growth. Ultimately, based on his horrible upbringing, Zenos should have been nothing. Instead, he managed to find a small spark from the Warrior of Light that he clung onto, twisted though it may be. It grew beyond what he was designed for, breaking free of the Garlean designs placed upon him, mirroring the very concept of the ancient gods losing control of creation, not to mention the questionable judgment upon creation itself. And though, by all rights, there should have been zero hope for Zenos to grow as a person because of his childhood trauma, by the end of Endwalker, for the first time in his life, his mind actually did reach out and meaningfully acknowledge the hopes of the Warrior of Light's desires. And he also took action, hoping that his assistance to the Warrior of Light will be reciprocated by the Warrior of Light's recognition of his desires, twisted though they may be. This is why I believe Zenos actually adds a critical dimension to Endwalker, within which we deal with the nature of despair and the hubris of the ancient gods' designs. Because Zenos, for all his twisted nature derived from his design, ultimately took the first step to being a proper human by the end of Endwalker, and that has to be worth something. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe if you like the content, and I'll see you all next time.
Ha! Acceptance! At long last! The conflagration of our clash will scorch even the stars!